Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. This is my very first Instagram live. It's definitely an anxiety. I have so much anxiety right now. It's definitely an exposure for myself. I'm just gonna pin the name of the talk really quick. CD and shame. Post and pin. I think I did it. Okay, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. So before we get started, feel free to post whatever questions you have into the chat, and I will get to as many of them as I possibly can. I know we had a few people who already asked a few questions, and so my wonderful assistant Amy is here, and so she's going to post some of those questions up for us too. My hope is to get to some of those. And I feel very grateful and blessed to have had the schooling and education and the mentors that I've had as a psychologist. My practice is in California. We also have some therapists that work under choice therapy that also practice over in Oregon as well. And one of the themes that I constantly come across in working with a lot of people with OCD and different types of anxiety disorders is not just anxiety, but also the shame of having an anxiety disorder. And so for some people with OCD, they may experience a certain amount of shame as a result of having certain unwanted thoughts, especially harm type thoughts. But for other people, just having a mental health disorder that impacts their sleep, impacts their relationships, it's super easy to just get caught up in the like, what's wrong with me? I know it's something I've certainly struggled with some of my own anxiety, especially being a therapist. Like, what's wrong with me? I should have my shit together as a therapist, and I should know how to be better at this. And unfortunately, that type of self-talk typically just adds to the cycle of the disorder and gets in the way of spending your time doing the things that you really want to be doing. And so one of the things that I wanted to sort of share were some of the tips and tricks that I've learned along the way that have been helpful for some of the clients I've worked with. And one of them in particular is like, how do you really kind of notice? So like the first step is the noticing of the critic, right? Shame is really about the thought of like, I am a bad person. Guilt is I've done something bad. Either way, both of those are really challenging experiences to have. And the first step is to just be aware of when our minds are talking to us in that way, being aware of when the critic is saying those things. And one of the questions was, how can I be more aware of my OCD? Well, whether it's the OCD or the critical mind, one of the things I typically recommend is some kind of daily mindfulness practice. Whether it's a formal like sitting meditation practice where you're listening to an app like Insight Timer or Calm. You can do it for 2 minutes is better than nothing at all. Or if those kind of meditations like aren't for you, you can also practice mindfulness and just everyday living. Like pick one activity you already do and choose to practice it mindfully. So if it's brushing your teeth, you're simply noticing what the bristles feel like on your teeth, the smell of the toothpaste, the taste of the toothpaste. Practicing mindfulness just allows us to really slow down and notice things more. And when we're able to notice things in a sooner type of way, we're then able to choose, okay, how do I want to proceed? So for example, if you're noticing an obsession showing up, you have a choice there, right? Okay, what does my OCD want me to do? Am I going to choose to do a compulsion, or am I going to choose to check in with my values and perhaps do the opposite of what the OCD is saying, or do something a little bit different? If you're noticing a critical thought, if you're beating on yourself when you're already down, right? Another option could be asking yourself, well, what would I say to a friend right now? And would I be willing to practice saying that very same thing to myself? And so the way I see it is having some kind of mindfulness practice is often the foundation for being able to work through shame, as well as things like OCD and anxiety disorders. Another tip or trick is reminding yourself that you're not alone in your suffering, right? There's so many people that struggle with OCD. There's so many people that struggle with different types of anxiety disorders, and keeping in mind that so much of the disorder is completely out of your control, right? Your genes, your family history, the type of learning you were exposed to, the type of coping you were exposed to, traumas in your life, right? Like, so much of this is completely out of your control, right? So reminding yourself you're not alone, right? Lots of people have OCD. Lots of people experience things like shame, anxiety, and that although you don't have control over the obsessions showing up, or over the initial worries or the initial criticalness, that you do have control over how you treat yourself once those experiences show up, right? When you're experiencing an obsession, that's a moment of suffering. That's a really hard moment. And although you don't have control over that, you do have control over the way you treat yourself in those moments, right? So if your best friend came to you and said, I'm having a really tough time right now, what would you say to them? And what would it be like for you to give yourself that very same love and kindness? I actually tried to infuse a lot of self-compassion techniques and interventions throughout the ACT workbook for OCD. Here it is. But there's a whole chapter specifically dedicated to self-compassion exercises for OCD. Another great resource that I love is the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. They have a ton of different kinds of meditations, as well as written exercises for those of you that prefer to write things out, to help teach us how to build and develop that compassionate voice. Most of us are capable of compassion. Like, most of us are actually pretty kind and generous to our friends and our loved ones. And so that tells us that you're capable of it. And it's just a matter of practicing it this way, right? Like, practicing it towards yourself and doing some of the meditations and the exercises, whether in my book or on mindfulselfcompassion.org, is just a beautiful way to help practice building it towards yourself. And so those are just some of the thoughts and ideas that I wanted to share with you. And I'm just kind of going through the different questions right now. So in terms of, one person asked, what are the best shame busters? And what I would say is, like, my go-to is two different exercises. One is, how would I treat a friend, which I already kind of went over, right? So when I'm having a difficult experience and I notice my mind saying, like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? I would ask, what would I say to a friend right now? And I would practice saying that to myself. Another shame buster per se is a self-compassion script. And you can check out mindfulselfcompassion.org to take you through a meditation that will help you create your own mindful self-compassion script. Or I also, Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, who created Mindful Self-Compassion, allowed me to borrow and adapt their model to people with OCD. And so one of the exercises I have in the ACT workbook for OCD is how to create your own self-compassion script. And so those are probably my two favorite shame busters. In terms of dealing with triggers, it's such a great question. So the question is, how do I deal with triggers, right? Triggers are events that happen either outside of us or inside of us that happen right before a person experiences anxiety or an obsession. And, practicing mindfulness and slowing down allows us to become aware of our triggers, which is a really good first step. Once you notice a trigger, right, I see it as an opportunity to practice having uncertainty and discomfort, right? When I think about the whole point of doing exposure work with OCD, I really think about it as like getting good at having uncertainty and discomfort in our lives. And so for people with OCD, this can be really challenging. And so a trigger is an opportunity to practice leaning into that uncertainty and discomfort. And so you can do that by doing an exposure. You can do that by doing the opposite of what the OCD is telling you. You can do that by kind of checking with your values and really say to yourself, like, how do I genuinely want to spend these next few minutes? What's in my heart? What's most important to me? Another question here is, how would you handle the ERP process when I'm doing an exposure? OCD says it doesn't feel right. It tries to get me to do or redo the compulsion. Really good question, Riley. So perfectionism is like the cousin of OCD. Perfectionism are basically the thoughts of like, you should be doing this better. You're not doing this right. It has to be right. Right? Perfectionism is always want you to do something bigger, better, more. And it is associated with pressure and anxiety and sometimes overwhelm. And so, the first thing is to really recognize like, oh, like this is perfectionism, right? Like this is the cousin to OCD that's always going to be there telling me I need to be doing things right or more. And a big part of that is kind of leaning into the fear that's often associated with perfectionism, which is I'm going to fail. And what I will say, and I imagine this might sting a little bit, is that you will fail. We all do. It's not a matter of if we will fail. We will fail. We will do things incorrectly. And it's something we all do, right? As human beings, a part of being a human being is failing. It's being vulnerable. It's knowing that we're not going to always get it right. We're going to mess up. And so when we do mess up, again, like how do we want to be towards ourselves in those moments? And allowing ourselves to take risks in the service of living, even if we fail. Because the beautiful thing about failing is that it also means learning, right? Every time I've failed in my life, and there's been many failures, it's always produced a wonderful amount of learning. So what I say is when OCD is saying you didn't do this compulsion right, you need to do it bigger, better, more, or different in some way, I would say good enough. What would a good enough exposure look like? You don't want to put in too much energy and you don't want to put in too little energy. Good enough. And keep in mind, folks, like none of this information is to replace therapy by any means. It's just to give you some tips and tricks to hopefully add to your practice or to be able to talk to your therapist about if you have one. If you don't have a therapist and really want to learn more about how to work with ERP, how to practice self-compassion, I highly recommend checking out iocdf.org. They're a wonderful organization that you can do a provider search on. So all of their providers specialize in OCD. You can put your zip code in and it'll give you a list of providers that can help you. If you're located in California or Oregon, you're welcome to reach out to info@choicetherapy.net. We offer therapy support groups. We're trying to kick off our teen support group right now. So if you know any teens with OCD, please send them our way. One of the cool things about running support groups is I really get to see what it looks like to combat shame. The feedback I get from running support groups is that like just to know you're not alone in it, right? To find not professionals but peers, right? People with OCD that can share their journey with you, can share their failures, can share their growth, to share the tips and tricks that they've learned along the way. So if you're not a part of a support group, highly recommend joining one. It's just a beautiful way to work through the shame and to just not feel so alone in suffering. Yeah, so I think that's all the questions that I have up here for right now. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I hope some of these tips and tricks were helpful. And feel free to email info@choicetherapy.net if you have any questions. Yay, I did my first live post. Thanks. Bye.